Howdy, Michael here. Today we're going to talk about cameras, or more specifically, shutter speed, ISO, white balance, focal length, and aperture. Let's talk about that. First thing we're going to talk about is your lens. Your lens dictates how your camera focuses on your subject, and every lens has two main functions: focal length and aperture. Focal length is essentially how zoomed in your lens is, from your ultra-wide lenses to your super telephotos. This also affects how compressed your image is, with wide lenses having very drawn-out distances, while telephotos have very compressed distances. The second function of your lens is aperture. Aperture, also called iris, works like your eye in that the wider it is, the more light it lets in, and the smaller it is, the less light it lets in. Aperture also affects your depth of field in that the more open your aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and the more closed your aperture, the deeper the depth of field. Now to our camera. Your camera has four main functions. It's frame rate, shutter speed, ISO, and white balance. Your frame rate is how many images are captured every second. By increasing your frame rate, you give yourself the ability to slow down your footage and get that nice buttery slow-mo that you see in so many travel vlogs. Like if you film at 60 frames per second, but you're only going to be exporting it at around 24 frames per second. That would allow you to slow it down by about 3 times, thus stretching out that moment even longer without losing any detail. If frames per second is how many images your camera is capturing every second, then your shutter speed is how fast your camera is capturing each of those images. Generally, you're going to want to keep your shutter speed at whatever 2 times your frames per second is. So if I'm filming at 24 frames per second, then I'm going to want to keep my shutter speed at around 48 or 50. This gives your image a nice motion blur and also is associated with a general film look. Increasing your shutter speed does 2 things to your image. It darkens it and also decreases the motion blur. This is because your camera is capturing the image so much quicker and your sensor doesn't have as much time to be able to expose to the light. Decreasing your shutter speed does the opposite. Because you're letting each frame have more time to expose, this means that your image will be brighter. However, it also means that your motion blur will be greater the lower your shutter speed is. ISO is basically how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is going to be, and the lower your ISO, the less sensitive. If your image is unbelievably dark and you try to crank up your ISO, your camera will start introducing artifacts as it tries to interpret what's in the darkness. This is why ISO should generally be the last thing you use when you try to change how your camera is interpreting light, because it actually downgrades the quality of your image. Finally, white balance. White balance is how your camera interprets the color temperature of lights, because different lights have different color temperatures. Daylight has more of a blue, while indoor tungstens have more of an orange. By adjusting your white balance, you allow your camera to acclimate itself to whatever lighting situation you're in, so that your lights don't look blue or orange, but they look more like a natural white. So, to sum up, focal length affects how zoomed in your lens is and how compressed your image is. Aperture affects how shallow your depth of field is, and also how much light your lens is letting into your camera. Frame rate affects how many images per second your camera is capturing, and shutter speed affects how fast your camera is capturing each of those images. ISO affects how sensitive your camera sensor is to light, and then your white balance affects what color temperature your camera is set to. Now that you know these basics, you should be able to use any camera to capture cinematic images. Next time, we'll go into a little bit more about lighting and how you can use it to expand your cinematic storytelling potential. Thanks for watching. Ciao.